Hi, welcome back. In this video, we're going to be discussing how an essay is structured. Previously, we spoke about how an essay is a multi-paragraph form of writing typically used to convey more detailed, thorough information for relatively sophisticated academic or professional purposes. We spoke about how I might use an essay to convince, for example, a politician to enact a certain legislation, but I wouldn't use an essay necessarily when speaking to a friend over text or even in an informal conversation. We also discussed how a paragraph is the constituent part of an essay. An essay must have multiple paragraphs in order to be considered an essay. However, every essay, whether that be a simple one-page report or a 300-page doctoral dissertation, has an essential structure that is necessary to master in order to produce effective, competent essays. In order to illustrate the structure to you, I think it's useful to use a kind of quick, in some cases, playful metaphor. We all are familiar with hamburgers, so please bear with me as I draw a simple but crude diagram of a hamburger. Pretend this is a bun, this is a patty, and this is the bottom bun. Again, not elegant, certainly nothing to find admiration in, but it will be helpful to us as we illustrate this point. As you can see, a burger on its most basic level is composed of three different components. We have the top bun, we have the patty itself, and we have the bottom bun. If I were to erase any of these particular parts of the burger, I wouldn't have a burger anymore. So for example, if I erase the top bun, I now just have a patty on top of a bottom bun, not what we consider a hamburger. That applies also, of course, if I were to remove any of the other parts. An essay is similar to this. Just like a basic hamburger, it has three constituent parts. The first of these is what we know as the introduction. Obviously, the introduction introduces whatever the major topic or thrust of the essay is. If I'm writing an essay about Martin Luther King Jr., for example, I would want to introduce that topic, that historical figure, in my introduction. An introduction is really important because without it, our readers have no real sense of direction when navigating the essay. The second constituent part of an essay is what is known as the body. In the body is where we would typically find our supporting details, pieces of evidence, and other critical, more detail-specific information that we're going to use to elaborate and flesh out our topic. So again, if I'm writing an essay about Martin Luther King Jr., whereas I might introduce in the introduction a sort of general sense of who he was and why he was historically significant, in my body is where I will provide more salient, specific details as to Martin Luther King Jr.'s life and historical significance. The final part of any given essay is the conclusion. So as the introduction introduces the topic, the conclusion wraps it up, so to speak. The conclusion is known for answering the so-called "so what" question. This is typical in ELA classes. It's a good way of getting students to think about why they wrote their essay to begin with. My Martin Luther King Jr. essay must have some kind of guiding or ultimate takeaway. Otherwise, the essay is fairly fruitless. Again, everything we write must have some sort of point or message that must be communicated to an audience. So if my essay does not have a clear takeaway, does not have a clear lesson or message, then my essay was ineffective at communicating to my audience. In this case, I would need to determine what the takeaway about Martin Luther King Jr. is. I introduce him in the beginning part of the essay, I provide supporting details and evidence in my body, and then in my conclusion, I must wrestle with that essential so what question as to what I want my reader to take away from the essay concerning Martin Luther King Jr. Just like a hamburger, the essay must have all three of these parts in order to exist as a competent functional essay. And like I said, the length of an essay doesn't matter. Most students are familiar with what we call the 5-point or 5-paragraph essay. This essay typically has an introduction, 3 body paragraphs, and a concluding paragraph, so 5 in total. However, this 5-paragraph structure is not at all the only way that an essay can be structured. One could have a 3-paragraph essay with a simple introduction, single body paragraph, and conclusion. One could have a 4-paragraph essay, intro, 2 body paragraphs, and a conclusion. One could have, as I mentioned before, a 300-page dissertation in which the introduction might be the first 50 pages of the entire essay. That introduction, being 50 pages, could itself be built and made up of smaller nested essays, the same way that an essay itself is made up of paragraphs, which are then, of course, made up of sentences. And of course, those are made up of words. So really what we see is as we increase the rigor and sophistication of any given written response, we are really just nesting within larger forms of writing, smaller forms of writing, all in the interest of delivering greater detail density to our readers, depending on the necessities of our topic. All right, so with that said, let me remove my shameful looking burger here. And let's summarize exactly what we mean by essay structure. So again, we have 3 essential components to an essay. We have the introduction. In this part, we introduce the topic, engage reader attention, provide some general details, and also discuss our thesis statement. Let me expand this here quickly. All right. A thesis statement, for those of us unaware, otherwise known as our controlling idea or main claim, or whatever other equivalent phrase, is essentially our main purpose, lesson, or takeaway for the essay. In other words, my thesis statement is the core of my essay. Think of our solar system, in which planets orbit around a central star, in this case, our sun. Your thesis statement in your essay is that sun, and you can think of your supporting details, your paragraphs, even your larger introduction and conclusion as various planets that orbit around that core. Without a strong, clear, specific thesis statement, our essay does not have an anchor. It's wayward and aimless. I've had coworkers describe the thesis statement as the map, quote unquote, of the essay. It provides the reader guidance and direction and allows him or her to navigate your ideas in a comprehensible way that allows him or her to retain information as much as possible. After we have our introduction, we then have our body. Body has the main goal of providing supporting details, illustrative examples, and/or pieces of evidence to support and articulate a thesis statement. So the body is where you would do your heavy lifting to guide the reader to a greater understanding of the thesis statement. Whereas the introduction is a fairly general paragraph, the body is where we would provide greater details, more examples, and pieces of evidence, depending on the genre of essay we're writing, to prove or support or develop our thesis statement. In some cases, our body can be seen as the real essay. This is where we provide most of the information and the intro and conclusion serve as framing devices for that content. Finally, we have the conclusion. Again, the conclusion's job is to wrap up the essay. To continue using our hamburger analogy, you can think of us as putting a foil wrap or aluminum wrap around the essay, and finally tying everything together. So the conclusion, in some cases, might seem unimportant compared to the body and even introduction, and yet it still serves a critical function. It is the last impression the reader has of the essay. It's the last opportunity for the writer to reinforce the main point, theme, or central idea of the essay. So in addition to wrapping up the essay, in many cases, we restate the thesis statement, as well as articulate and reinforce major takeaway, or even major takeaways if there are multiple of the essay. We need to answer the so what question. And again, if we do not answer that so what question, if we do not communicate what is really important or meaningful about our essay, our reader will leave our essay having learned little to nothing. That so what question is essentially our guiding question. As a reader is reading an essay, he or she should have very few questions about content, about structure. Think of every question as a stone in the road that causes the reader to trip and stumble. The path is not easy and curated, but rather difficult to traverse. When you're writing an essay, you want to ensure that your so what question is always very clearly understood and referenced, and that your essay escalates from a general introduction through a more specific body to, again, a more general conclusion, with the intent of then providing that lesson or takeaway to the reader. Another way that we can think about the structure of an essay is in an hourglass format. So let's imagine that our introduction is like a upside down triangle that starts fairly general and then becomes increasingly specific. So if I'm introducing a topic, again, I'll use Martin Luther King Jr. I begin with relatively general information about Martin Luther King Jr. I then terminate in a fairly specific thesis statement about Martin Luther King Jr. I then use my body, which would be the nexus point between the two hourglass shapes, the intro and the conclusion, to provide information and content about Martin Luther King Jr. And then I would use my conclusion to then extrapolate some kind of lesson about Martin Luther King Jr. from the content that I discussed in the body. So as you can see, I go from general to specific, and then to specific to general. I explore a topic, find some kind of key theme or message, and then I extrapolate that in the conclusion for the sake of my reader's ultimate takeaway and lesson to be learned from the essay. Finally, I think it's important to consider an easy mnemonic for essay structure. I like to use IBC, which again stands for intro, body, conclusion, as an easy abbreviation to help guide discussions about essay structure. In future videos, I will be using IBC to quickly refer to intro, body, conclusion. Again, I think it's really critical to understand as much as possible why intro, body, conclusion are essential to the function of any essay. Regardless of length and regardless of genre, all essays will fundamentally have an introduction that introduces the topic, a body that explores the topic, and a conclusion that provides the takeaway and insight, what we may even call world connection to the topic itself. The simple one-page report does this. The 300-page doctoral dissertation does this too. And if you can master this structure and understand fluently why it's used, you'll find that writing any type of essay in any type of genre will be much easier. Thank you again for joining me in this video, and I will see you in the next one.